The year was 2187. Earth wasn't the bright blue jewel it once was in old photos. Decades of war over water, energy, and space had left scars, not just on the planet, but on everyone living on it. Still, humanity had managed to reach the stars. Faster than light travel had opened the door, and after years of silence from the cosmos, a signal finally came back. Not a warning, not a threat, an invitation. It came from the heart of the galaxy, a repeating pulse of light and math, clear as day to anyone who knew how to listen. All thinking beings are welcome, it seemed to say. Come speak. Come join. The Terran Coalition, the shaky alliance of what remained of Earth's governments, saw it as their one chance. Not just to explore, but to prove they were more than their past. They scrambled to put together a delegation. Scientists, diplomats, linguists, people who could talk, not fight. But space wasn't safe yet. Pirates, rogue colonies, and leftover war machines still lurked in the dark. So they couldn't send just a peaceful ship. They had to send protection, and that's how the fleet ended up looking more like an armada than an embassy. At its center was the Odyssey, a massive vessel built from the bones of an old warship. Its hull still bore the marks of recent battles, scorch lines from plasma fire, patched up breaches, and dark stains that cleaning crews couldn't fully scrub away. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ozone and something else, something metallic like old blood. No one talked about it, but everyone knew. The crew moved quietly through the corridors, not with pride but with exhaustion. Most of them had fought in the resource wars, the brutal conflicts that had torn apart Mars and the outer colonies just a few years earlier. They'd followed orders. Some of those orders had been ugly. Now they were being asked to represent humanity to the rest of the galaxy. The irony wasn't lost on them. The captain stood on the bridge, hands resting on the edge of the command console. He hadn't slept in 2 days. His eyes were tired but sharp. He kept replaying the briefing in his head. Present humanity as peaceful, as ready, as worthy. But how could they when their ship still carried the ghosts of what they'd done? Down in the diplomatic wing, the ambassador paced nervously. She'd spent her whole life preparing for first contact, studying alien linguistics, interstellar law, cultural protocols. But nothing in her training covered what to do when your own people had spent the last decade bombing each other into rubble. She kept checking the ship's external cameras, watching the other vessels in the fleet. One of them, the Vigilant, had been used in the suppression of the Titan labor uprising. She'd seen the reports. Civilians caught in the crossfire. No survivors. She wanted to believe they were turning a corner, that this mission could be a fresh start. But every time she looked out the viewport at the stars, she wondered if the universe already knew the truth. Meanwhile, in the engine room, a young engineer wiped grease from her hands and stared at a flickering readout. She'd signed up for this mission because she believed in it. Not in governments or flags, but in the idea that humans could be better. She'd lost her brother in the Jovian skirmishes, not to enemy fire, but to a miscommunication, a botched evacuation order. She didn't hate the system. She just wanted it to change. And maybe out there among the stars, change was possible. As the fleet approached the edge of known space, the jump point that would take them to the galactic core, the tension thickened. Everyone held their breath. This wasn't just a journey. It was a test. And humanity hadn't exactly been studying. The captain gave the order. Initiate warp sequence. The stars stretched into lines. Space folded. For a moment, everything went silent. Even the hum of the engine seemed to pause. Then, with a soft shudder, they arrived. But they weren't alone. Dozens of ships hung in the void, arranged in perfect symmetry around a massive structure that pulsed with soft blue light. These weren't human designs. Some looked like living coral, others like crystalline sculptures, a few like nothing anyone on the Odyssey could even describe. They didn't move. They didn't signal, they just watched. Then a beam of light swept over the human fleet, not hostile, scanning, probing. Within seconds, alarms chirped softly on the bridge. Biological residue detected on outer hulls, a technician reported, voice tight. It's organic human and not just traces. It's embedded in the plating. The captain's stomach dropped. He knew what that meant. Those stains, the ones they couldn't wash off, weren't just dirt. They were remains, from battles, from accidents, from things they'd hoped to leave behind. On the main screen, a new image appeared. Grainy at first, then sharp. It showed a small civilian transport Martian registry, drifting near Jupiter's moons. Then a flash, a human warship firing, the transport vanishing in a cloud of fire and ice. The bridge went dead silent. Someone whispered, "That was us." The ambassador closed her eyes. She didn't need to ask which ship had fired. She already knew. Outside, the alien vessels remained still. But something had shifted. The air, though there was none in space, felt heavier. Judgment wasn't coming in words or weapons. It was coming in silence. And that was worse. Back in the engine room, the young engineer stared at her screen as the scan results trickled down to her station. She saw the same footage. Her hands trembled. She thought of her brother. She thought of all the people who never got a chance to see the stars. And now here they were, humanity's face to the galaxy, arriving not with open hands but with blood on their sleeves. No one spoke for a long time. There was nothing to say. The captain finally broke the silence. "Lock all external comms. No transmissions unless I approve it." He turned to the ambassador. "We can't lie, not here." "Not now," she nodded slowly. "Then we tell the truth." "But how do you explain a war to beings who might have never fought one?" He asked more to himself than to her. No one had an answer. In the mess hall, a group of soldiers sat quietly, their meals untouched. One of them had been on the vigilant during the Titan incident. He remembered the faces, the voices over the comms begging for mercy. He'd told himself it was orders, that it was necessary. But now, floating in front of the galaxy's eyes, necessary felt like a hollow excuse. The fleet hung in place, caught between hope and shame. They'd come to show the universe what humanity could be. Instead, they'd shown it what humanity had been, and the universe was watching. The captain walked to the observation deck, alone. He pressed his palm against the cold glass and looked out at the alien ships. He thought about Earth, the broken cities, the refugee camps on Luna, the kids growing up in domes on Mars who'd never seen rain. He thought about all the mistakes, all the chances they'd wasted, but he also thought about the engineer in the engine room, the ambassador who still believed in diplomacy, the scientists who'd spent years decoding the invitation, not for glory but for connection. Maybe they weren't ready. Maybe they never would be. But they were here, and that had to count for something. He took a deep breath. Whatever came next, rejection, punishment, silence, they would face it. Not as soldiers or politicians, but as humans, flawed, scarred, and trying, however clumsily, to do better. The stars didn't blink. The alien ships didn't move. But somewhere, deep in the heart of that glowing structure, a decision was being made, and humanity waited. The silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight. No greetings, no signals. Just those alien ships, perfectly still, forming a ring around the human fleet as if holding them in place. The Odyssey's crew watched the main view screen, hearts pounding, breaths shallow. They'd expected awe, maybe even fear, but not this quiet, heavy judgment that seemed to press against the hull like deep ocean water. Then, without warning, a new image appeared on every screen across the fleet. It wasn't a message in words or symbols. It was a recording, raw, unedited, brutal. A small Martian transport vessel, barely more than a cargo hauler, drifting near the ice rings of Saturn. On board were families, miners, teachers, children trying to escape the last flare-up of the resource wars. And then, from the shadows, a human warship emerged. Not pirates. Not rebels. Official coalition markings. It fired without warning, one shot. The transport vanished in a silent bloom of fire and frozen vapor. The bridge crew froze. Some turned away. Others stared, unable to look but unable to look away either. The ambassador gripped the edge of her seat, knuckles white. She knew that footage. It had been buried in classified archives, scrubbed from public records. How did they have it? A soft chime echoed through the ship. Not an alarm. Something calmer, almost mournful. Then a voice, not spoken but felt, filled their minds. Not in English, not in any human language, but in pure meaning, clear as thought. "You arrive with blood on your metal, explain." No one answered right away. What could they say? It was war. We had no choice? Those words felt cheap now, like paper shields against a storm. Outside, one of the alien vessels drifted closer. It looked like a living sculpture, smooth silver with veins of soft blue light pulsing beneath its surface. From its side, a narrow beam extended. Not a weapon, but a docking arm. A silent command. Come aboard. Alone. The captain knew what that meant. Someone had to go. Not a soldier. Not a technician. Someone who could speak for all of them. The ambassador stepped forward before anyone could stop her. I'll go, she said quietly. It's my job. They suited her up in a plain white diplomatic pod. No weapons, no hidden tech, just a translator chip and a small data drive containing humanity's history, art, music, and yes, even the war logs. As the pod detached and floated toward the alien structure, the entire fleet held its breath. Inside the pod, the ambassador felt strangely calm. She wasn't afraid of death. She was afraid of being misunderstood, of humanity being written off before they even got a chance to change. The docking arm opened into a vast chamber unlike anything she'd ever seen. The walls shimmered like liquid glass, reflecting not her image, but moments from Earth's past. Forests burning, cities rising, children laughing, bombs falling. The floor was warm beneath her boots, humming with energy, and in the center stood tall, slender beings made of what looked like polished obsidian and living crystal. Their faces had no eyes, yet she felt them watching her deeply, completely. One stepped forward. It didn't speak. Instead, the air around her shifted, and suddenly she was there. Not in the chamber, but on Mars during the evacuation of New Ares colony. She could smell the smoke, hear the screams, feel the panic as coalition forces opened fire on civilians who refused to surrender their water recyclers. She wasn't just remembering it, she was reliving it. From every angle. The soldier pulling the trigger, the mother shielding her child, the engineer trying to shut down the reactor before it melted down. She fell to her knees, gasping, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't punishment. It was truth. And truth, she realized, hurt more than any weapon. When the vision faded, she was back in the chamber, trembling. The beings hadn't moved. But now a new image formed in the air between them, a simple question shaped in light. Why? She took a shaky breath. We were afraid, she said aloud, knowing they'd understand. We thought there wasn't enough water, enough space, enough time. We hurt each other because we didn't know how else to survive. The beings exchanged no words, but a ripple passed through them, like wind through tall grass. Then one raised a hand and the chamber walls shifted again. This time they showed other species, strange, beautiful, some barely recognizable as life. One looked like a swarm of glowing insects, another like a floating forest, and each had a moment of darkness, a planet scorched, a rebellion crushed, a betrayal that split a civilization in two. The message was clear. You are not the first. Relief and shame washed over her at once. They weren't alone in their flaws, but that didn't excuse them. If anything, it made their actions more tragic because they knew better. They'd seen history. They'd read about Earth's own wars, its genocides, its recoveries, and still they'd repeated the same mistakes among the stars. Back on the Odyssey, the captain watched the feed from the ambassador's pod. He saw her kneeling. He saw the visions playing around her. He saw the alien beings, calm, ancient, patient. And for the first time in years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: humility. Down in engineering, the young technician stared at her screen, tears in her eyes. She'd seen the same feed. She thought of her brother again, not with anger now, but with sorrow. Maybe if they'd all been a little kinder, a little wiser, he'd still be alive. Maybe if humanity had listened to its own better angels, they wouldn't be standing here, begging for a second chance. Hours passed. The pod remained docked. The human fleet stayed perfectly still. Engines idling, weapons powered down. No one dared move. No one even whispered. Then finally the pod detached and began its slow return. When the ambassador stepped back onto the Odyssey, she looked older, as if years had passed in those few hours. She didn't speak right away. She just walked to the observation deck and stared out at the alien ring. The captain joined her. What did they say? They didn't say anything, she replied softly. But they showed me everything. They know what we've done. And they know we know it too, so what now? She turned to him, eyes tired but clear. Now we wait. And we hope that knowing is enough to start changing. Outside, the alien ships began to shift. Not aggressively, but deliberately. One by one, they opened pathways, forming a corridor leading toward the massive structure at the center. The Nexus Spire, as the humans had started calling it. It wasn't an invitation to join, not yet, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was a chance. The fleet moved slowly, carefully following the path. As they drew closer, details of the spire became visible. Towers of light, gardens growing in zero gravity, beings of all shapes moving in quiet harmony. It was beautiful, peaceful, everything Earth hadn't been in a long time. The ambassador placed a hand on the cold glass. "They've built this after everything they've been through too," she murmured. "Maybe that's the real test. Not whether we've sinned, but whether we're willing to build something better after." The captain nodded. He didn't have answers. None of them did. But for the first time since they'd left Earth, he felt something besides dread. It was small, fragile, but real. Hope. And out there among the stars, with blood still on their ships and shame in their hearts, that was the only thing they had left to offer. The human delegation wasn't led to a courtroom. There were no judges in robes, no gavels, no rows of spectators. Instead, they were guided, gently, silently, into a vast open space deep inside the Nexus Spire. The chamber had no walls, just shifting curtains of light that bent and flowed like water. The floor was smooth and warm, and the air smelled faintly of rain and something earthy, like old stone after a storm. They stood in a circle marked on the ground, just a thin ring of silver light. Around them, beings from dozens of worlds watched from floating platforms, their forms as varied as their home stars. Some had wings, some had no bodies at all, just shimmering clouds of thought given shape. None spoke. None moved. They simply observed. This was the Chamber of Echoes, and it didn't need words to pass judgment. The moment the humans stepped inside the ring, the air changed. It wasn't sound they heard, it was memory. Not their own, but the memories of those they'd hurt. A child's cry from a Martian shelter as oxygen ran out. The last breath of a miner trapped under rubble after a coalition bombing. The silence of an entire colony ship drifting dead in space. Its crew gone because someone decided their water was worth more than their lives. One of the soldiers from the fleet doubled over, hands on his knees, retching. He'd been on that mission near Titan. He remembered giving the order to fire. He told himself it was to stop a rebellion. But now, standing here, he felt the weight of every life he'd erased. Not as numbers on a screen, but as real people with real pain. The ambassador closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She hadn't pulled a trigger, but she'd signed off on policies. She'd stayed silent when she should have spoken up. In this place, silence wasn't peace, it was complicity. Then from the edge of the chamber, a figure approached. It moved slowly, deliberately. Its body was covered in thick, scaled plates, and its eyes glowed a dull amber. It looked ancient, worn, not by time, but by regret. This being didn't belong to the graceful, light-filled species that ran the Conquered. This one carried its own scars. It stopped just outside the silver ring and tilted its head. A voice came, not through sound, but directly into their minds, rough and heavy, like stone grinding against stone. "You are not the first to arrive, stained." The humans looked at each other, confused. The being stepped closer, and images flickered in the air around it. Ruined cities under twin suns, oceans turned to ash, entire forests burned to glass. This species, the Cathor, had once ruled a wide stretch of the galaxy. They'd believed strength was the only law. They'd crushed anyone who stood in their way, and when they finally reached the Conquered, they too had come with blood on their ships. "They gave us a choice," the Cathor shared. "Leave your weapons, leave your pride, or leave forever." The humans listened, hearts pounding. The Cathor didn't offer comfort. It offered truth. We chose to stay, but staying meant facing what we'd done. Not once, every day, for generations. One of the younger diplomats whispered, "Is that what's happening to us now?" The Cathor's gaze settled on them. The Conquered does not punish. It reveals. If you cannot bear your own reflection, you will not last here. Back on the Odyssey, the rest of the crew watched the feed from the chamber. In the mess hall, a group of engineers sat in silence. One of them had lost family in the Belt conflicts. He'd joined the fleet hoping to help build a better future. Now he wondered if humanity even deserved one. In the medical bay, a doctor stared at her hands. She'd treated soldiers who'd committed atrocities, and civilians who'd suffered them. She'd never taken sides, just healed. But here, in this place, neutrality felt like betrayal. Meanwhile, inside the Chamber of Echoes, the pressure grew heavier. The memories didn't stop. They layered on, more voices, more losses, more moments where humanity had chosen fear over kindness, power over peace. Some of the delegation members sank to their knees. Others stood rigid, jaw clenched, fighting not to break. Then something unexpected happened. One of the humans, a quiet linguist who'd barely spoken since arrival, stepped forward, out of the ring. The silver light flared but didn't stop her. She looked up at the watching beings and spoke, her voice trembling but clear. "We didn't come here to hide what we've done," she said. "We came because we're tired of it. Tired of hurting each other. Tired of pretending we're the only ones who matter." She turned to the Cathor. "You stayed. You changed. Is there still room for us to try?" A long silence followed. The chamber seemed to hold its breath. Then the Cathor reached into a pouch at its side and pulled out a small dark stone. Smooth, black, cool to the touch. It held it out. Not to the ambassador. Not to the captain. But to the linguist. "Truth is the first language of this place," and it said. "You just spoke it. That is your first step." The linguist took the stone. It felt heavy, like it carried the weight of 1,000 apologies. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it mattered. Outside the chamber, the alien observers began to move, not away, but closer. Not in anger, but curiosity. One floated down, its form like woven starlight, and gently touched the ambassador's shoulder. A feeling passed through her, not words, but understanding. "We see you. Not just your past, but your wish to be better." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. Back on the ship, the captain watched the feed and finally exhaled. He'd expected condemnation. Instead, they'd been given a mirror and a chance to look into it without turning away. Later, as the delegation returned to the Odyssey, they were quiet. No one celebrated. No one cheered. But something had shifted. The shame was still there, yes, but now it had a purpose. It wasn't just a burden. It was fuel. In the engine room, the young technician held the black stone the linguist had brought back. She ran her fingers over its surface and thought of her brother. She thought of all the people who never got to see this moment. The moment humanity finally stopped running from its mistakes and stood still long enough to face them. Up on the bridge, the captain looked out at the spire, glowing softly against the endless dark. They weren't heroes. They weren't even guests yet, but they were still here. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Because sometimes the bravest thing a species can do isn't to conquer the stars, but to admit it's been wrong and still ask for a seat at the table. The silence after the Chamber of Echoes wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air before a storm breaks. Back aboard the Odyssey, no one spoke much. People moved through the corridors with their heads down, not out of shame alone, but because they were thinking. Really thinking. For the first time, they weren't just carrying out orders or following plans. They were asking themselves, what now? The captain sat alone in his quarters, staring at a small screen showing Earth from orbit, clouds swirling over continents still scarred by war. He'd spent his whole life believing that strength meant control, that survival meant striking first. But the Cathor's words kept echoing in his mind. Truth is the first language. And the truth was, humanity had been lying, to others and to themselves for a long time. Down in the comms bay, the linguist held the black stone the Cathor had given her. It felt warm in her palm, like it held a quiet pulse. She didn't know what it was made of, but she knew what it meant. A beginning. Not an end. Then an idea came to her. Small at first, then growing like a spark in dry grass. She turned to the main console and began typing. Not a message to the conquered. Not a plea or an excuse. She pulled up every classified file from the resource wars. Every battle log, every command order, every casualty report. The raw, unfiltered truth of what humanity had done, both good and terrible. She didn't ask for permission. She just did it. Within minutes, the data began streaming, not just to the Concord, but to every human colony, every ship, every settlement from Luna to the edge of the Kuiper Belt. No filters. No edits, just the facts. On Mars, in a dusty dome where children played in recycled air, a teacher paused her lesson when the alert popped up on the classroom screen. She hesitated, then opened it. As footage played, of supply drops denied, of refugee ships turned away, of soldiers following orders that cost innocent lives, the room fell silent. A boy raised his hand and asked, "Did we really do that?" The teacher didn't lie. "Yes," she said. "But maybe we don't have to keep doing it." On a mining station near Neptune, a group of workers gathered around a flickering monitor. One of them had lost his entire family in a coalition security sweep. He watched the logs, jaw tight, tears in his eyes, not just from anger but from relief. Someone had finally told the truth. Someone had finally seen them. Back on the Odyssey, chaos erupted at first. Officers shouted. Security teams scrambled. The captain was called to the bridge in a panic. "She's broadcasting everything," someone yelled. "She's ruined us." But when the captain saw what was happening, not just the data going out but the responses coming back, he didn't shut it down. He stood there, watching messages flood in from colonies that hadn't spoken to Earth in years. Not threats, not blame, just questions, just pain, just hope. "She didn't ruin us," he finally said, voice quiet but firm. "She gave us a chance to be real." Meanwhile, aboard the conquered Spire, the Cathor Elder watched the human transmission unfold through the shared network of the galaxy. It didn't react with surprise. It nodded slowly as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Later that day, it returned to the human delegation. This time it didn't come alone. A Jarkai, tall, crystalline beings who served as the Concord's keepers of balance, floated beside it. They carried no weapons, only a single object, a smooth obsidian shard identical to the one given to the linguist. The Cathor placed it gently in the captain's hand. "You have chosen to speak your truth even when it burn," it shared. "That is rare. Many species hide, many lie. You did not." The captain looked at the shard, then at his crew. "We're not proud of what's in those files," he said. "But we're done pretending it didn't happen." The Jarkai pulsed with soft light. A feeling passed through the room, not words, but understanding. Humanity would not be cast out, not yet, but they would be watched, closely. Their actions from this moment on would matter more than their past. That night, something changed across human space. On Earth, protests turned into town halls. On Mars, old enemies sat together and talked about rebuilding, not just cities, but trust. In orbit, ships that once pointed guns at each other now shared supplies and data. The truth hadn't fixed everything, but it had cracked the wall wide open. Aboard the Odyssey, the young technician from engineering sat with the linguist, both staring out the viewport at the glowing spire. "Do you think they'll ever really accept us?" she asked. The linguist smiled faintly. "I don't think it's about being accepted. I think it's about being honest. And maybe that's enough to start." Back on the bridge, the captain received a new message, not from the Concord, but from a small science outpost on Ceres. It was a simple request. "Can we send a student to observe the Concord's ecological systems? We want to learn how to heal, not just survive." He approved it without hesitation. In the days that followed, the human fleet remained under quarantine, as required. Their weapons were locked down. Their hulls were scanned again and again. But this time the scans didn't feel like judgment, they felt like care. Like someone was making sure they wouldn't bring their old wounds into this new world. And slowly, quietly, humanity began to change. Not because they were forced to, but because they finally saw themselves clearly. The blood on their ships hadn't disappeared. But now, instead of hiding it, they were learning how to wash it off, together. The captain stood once more on the observation deck, the black shard in his pocket. He thought of all the people back home reading the truth for the first time. He thought of the kids on Mars asking hard questions. He thought of the engineer who still believed in better days. They hadn't fixed everything. Far from it. But for the first time in a long time, they were moving in the right direction. Not away from their past, but through it. And out there, among the stars, that was the only kind of progress that truly mattered. The Odyssey turned slowly in the void, its once proud warship silhouette now softened by layers of neutral gray paint applied under Concord supervision. All weapons had been sealed, all combat systems disabled. Even the ship's name had been changed on official records, no longer a symbol of conquest but of journey. They weren't leaving as heroes. They weren't even leaving as equals. But they were leaving with a chance. Inside, the mood was quiet, not sad, not joyful, but thoughtful. Like people who'd just woken from a long, troubled dream and were finally seeing the world clearly for the first time. The crew moved with purpose, not pride. They'd been given a role, small but real, observer status. No vote in the conquered, no fleet of their own, no expansion beyond the Sol system until they proved they could live without tearing each other apart. It wasn't punishment. It was probation. And strangely, it felt like mercy. The captain stood on the bridge one last time before departure. He looked at the view screen, where the Nexus spire glowed like a heartbeat made of light. He thought of all the species that had stood where he stood, broken, ashamed, hoping. Some had failed. Some had risen. Now it was humanity's turn. Down in the cargo bay, something unexpected was happening. A small group gathered around a newly retrofitted shuttle, not armed, not armored, but filled with books, seed banks, medical kits, and open-source science modules. This wasn't a military craft, it was a classroom with wings. A young person from Mars stood at its entrance, adjusting a simple gray uniform with no rank, no insignia, just a small emblem of Earth and its moons. They'd been chosen not for skill in battle, but for curiosity, for patience, for the ability to listen more than speak. They weren't a soldier. They were a student. And they were about to board a Concord-sanctioned vessel bound for the Galactic Core, not to represent humanity's power, but its willingness to learn. The ambassador watched from a distance, arms crossed, eyes glistening. She remembered the panic, the fear, the shame of their arrival. Now she saw something else. Humility with hope attached. That was worth more than any treaty. As the Odyssey prepared to jump back to Sol space, the crew gathered in the mess hall, not for a celebration, but for a moment of silence. No speeches, no grand promises, just quiet reflection. Someone played an old Earth song, just a simple melody on a worn-out instrument. Something about coming home after a long night. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Back on Earth, the changes were slow but real. Old monuments to war generals were being replaced with gardens. Schools taught not just history but ethics, how to disagree without destroying. On Mars, former enemies worked side by side to rebuild water farms, not because they had forgotten the past, but because they refused to let it write their future. The truth broadcast from the Odyssey hadn't fixed everything overnight, but it had started conversations that couldn't be undone. People were angry, yes, but they were also listening, and in a species that had spent centuries shouting, listening was revolutionary. The jump sequence began. Stars stretched, space folded. The spire vanished behind them, not as a judge but as a distant light on the horizon, something to grow toward, not run from. Inside the shuttle bound for the core, the young Martian student looked out at the endless dark and felt not fear but wonder. They carried no weapons, no secrets, no hidden agenda, just questions, and a notebook filled with sketches of alien plants they hoped to study, star maps they wanted to understand, and ideas for how to bring clean fusion tech back to the colonies, not to power weapons, but to warm homes. They thought of their grandparents who'd fled Earth during the worst of the droughts. They thought of their parents who'd worked in domes under red skies, dreaming of peace. And now, here they were, on the edge of everything, not to conquer, but to connect. The captain, back on the Odyssey, finally allowed himself to rest. He sat in his quarters, the black shard from the Cathor resting on his desk beside a photo of Earth, green patches returning where forests had burned, rivers running clearer than they had in decades. It wasn't perfect, but it was healing. He knew the road ahead would be long. There would be setbacks. Old habits don't vanish in a day. But for the first time, humanity wasn't trying to prove it was the strongest species in the galaxy. It was trying to prove it could be kind, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the ship neared the edge of Sol space, a message came through, not from the conquered, but from a small research station on Europa. It was simple. We've started teaching kids about the Conquered's peace protocols. They asked if we could build a garden like the ones in the spire. We said yes. The captain smiled. Small things, quiet things. That's how change really happened. Not in grand battles, but in classrooms, in gardens, in the choice to tell the truth even when it hurts. When the Odyssey finally dropped out of warp near Earth's orbit, the planet looked different. Not because it had changed overnight, but because they were seeing it with new eyes. No longer a prize to be fought over, but a home to be cared for. Below in cities and domes and orbital stations, people looked up as the ship passed overhead. Some waved, some cried. Some just stood in silence, remembering all they'd lost and all they still had a chance to save. Humanity hadn't been welcomed into the galactic family with open arms, but they hadn't been turned away either. They'd been given something far more valuable, a mirror and the time to look into it. And as the Odyssey docked gently at the Luna station, its hull still bearing faint traces of old battles, but now also carrying seeds, data, and a new kind of courage, the crew stepped out not as warriors but as witnesses. Witnesses to what they'd done, witnesses to what they could become. The blood hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined them. Now their choices would. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like a beginning worth believing in.